Hi, I'm Mike Lee, author of Our Lost Constitution. In this series of Facebook Live videos, I'm trying to discuss the Constitution, as many aspects of my book as I can, especially in the days leading up to Constitution Day. This evening, I'll be discussing some of the material I cover in the introduction to my book, to Our Lost Constitution. I explain some of the reasons why I became interested in the Constitution at an early age, why it is that I found it interesting back then, and how that has shaped my views of the Constitution moving forward. As I explain in my book, I was raised in a home in which we discussed the Constitution around the dinner table. I think I was 30 before I realized not every family does that. That this was just something we did in my home. My late father, Rex Lee, was a professor of constitutional law. He was the founding dean of the law school at Brigham Young University. And he later became the Solicitor General to President Ronald Reagan in 1981. The Solicitor General is the federal government's chief advocate before the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the Solicitor General's whole job is to argue Supreme Court cases. In his case, his client was the United States government, and more to the point, the Ronald Reagan administration. Initially, when he got that job, I saw it as a really good opportunity for me to miss school. I found that if I wanted to go to court with my dad, my parents would be very pleased. And it was a lot more fun going to the Supreme Court than it was sitting in school. It was a lot more interesting. Initially, this was like attending church in a foreign language. You had to sit really still. These people would come up and tell you to sit up straight. If you slouched even slightly, you couldn't talk, you couldn't chew gum. And you had to pay attention. I didn't always understand what was going on. At first, the words were hard to understand. Over time, I developed an appreciation for what was happening. Initially, I was most interested by trying to figure out which justice was going to ask the first question, which lawyer was going to have a tougher time asking the question. Sometimes I discovered that some of the justices would occasionally appear to fall asleep on the stand. I loved it when they did that. It was fascinating, because then I'd make bets about which one would fall asleep first, who would wake up first, what they would do when they would wake up, and so forth. But this, meaning government and the Constitution, this was something we just discussed in our home. And so from an early age, we would talk around the dinner table about things like, why we have a Constitution, what it does, why it matters. When I was about 10 years old, I remember discussing Roe versus Wade with my dad. I commented to him something that just came reflexively to me because of previous conversations I had had with him. I pointed out to him, doesn't this seem like the wrong venue of government? Doesn't this seem like the wrong level of government to decide something like abortion? It seems to me that this is more of a legislative issue than a judicial issue, and that it probably ought to be decided at a state level rather than at a federal level, given that it's not set aside in the Constitution as a federal issue. I thought my dad was going to come unglued. He was so happy. I think he could tell at that moment that I was paying attention when he had talked to me about the Constitution. So that was my background. That's kind of how I was raised, and that's one of the reasons why I've always found these issues very interesting. Now, a couple years after that conversation, a year or two later, the abortion issue, and the abortion issue as it presents itself in the U.S. Supreme Court, showed up at my front door. I mean, literally at my front door. When I was about 11 years old, while my dad was serving as the Solicitor General under President Reagan, one Saturday morning, I woke up and was eating breakfast. My parents had gone shopping. My siblings had mostly gone somewhere else. I later discovered my sister Wendy was home, but I didn't realize it until later. We had a big family, 7 kids, and so whenever there was only one of us home or one or two of us home, it seemed like the house was empty. I was enjoying the quiet morning, enjoying having breakfast alone, and all of a sudden I looked out the window and I saw an unusual sight for our home in this quiet suburban neighborhood in Northern Virginia. I saw what appeared to be a Greyhound bus, a large passenger bus that had pulled up right in front of our house. Our street was barely even large enough to accommodate this bus, and I couldn't figure out why it was there. All of a sudden, as I looked more closely, I saw people were piling out of the bus. Dozens and dozens of them were getting out of this bus, and they were walking up and down the sidewalk right in front of our home, chanting something. I couldn't hear what they were saying initially. They were holding posters. I couldn't tell from that distance what they were saying. So I ended up going outside. I went out through the back door, so they wouldn't see me at first, or at least that's what I thought. As I got closer, I could tell that what they were chanting was, "Keep your laws off our bodies." They were chanting this over and over and over again. This was men, women, and children chanting this. And I thought, why on earth are they doing this in front of my house on a perfectly good Saturday morning? Don't they have anything better to do? I didn't know what they were talking about. I had a feeling that it had something to do with my dad, but I wasn't sure, and he wasn't there to explain it to me. So I went outside and walked up to them and approached the woman who appeared to be kind of in charge. And within the whatever level of confidence an 11-year-old boy can have, I just asked her the question, "Hello, I live here. What are you doing? Why are you here?" She very condescendingly spoke to me in the most condescending tone imaginable. Said, "Well, little boy, first of all, we want you to know that we're not here to hurt you." That kind of gave me the creeps, as you might imagine. Normally when someone tells you, your very first interaction with them ever, "We're not going to hurt you," sometimes that gives you a little bit of a reason to fear. Sort of if you're passing someone in a dark alleyway and they said, "Don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you," that kind of gives you the creeps. It gave me the creeps at that moment. But nonetheless, I stayed there and I continued to speak with her. And I said, "Okay, so you're not going to hurt me. What are you doing?" Again, with this incredibly condescending tone, she said to me, "Well, we just disagree with some of the things that your daddy is doing at work." And I said, "Okay, I understand that. That's fine. But why do you have to do this in front of my house? Why do you have to do it right here in my front yard?" And she said to me, "Well, we're being very careful not to step on your front yard. In fact, we're being very careful to walk only on the sidewalk. And we're just voicing our disagreement with some of the things that your daddy is doing at work." And so with that, I decided to leave. She obviously wasn't getting it. As I walked away, I thought, it's kind of missing the point. My concern was not about the legal technicalities of whether or not she was staying within the curtilage, whether or not she was staying within the easement that went along the sidewalk. I was not talking about property law, nor was I talking about whether or not they were trespassing. I was asking whether or not it was wildly inappropriate for 100 people to get on a bus. I later found out they were from the New York and New Jersey area. Travel a great distance to go and show up to somebody's house, the home of a private citizen who happened to be serving in government, in order to protest right in front of the home where that public servant was raising 7 children. That, it seemed to me, was wildly inappropriate, and her answer to my question, suggesting, well, it's okay because we're walking only along the sidewalk, didn't give me any comfort at all. In fact, that was pretty ridiculous. Now, I later learned the reason why they were there. My dad was making arguments at that time in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the Reagan administration in a case called City of Akron versus Akron Center for Reproductive Health. This was a case involving the constitutionality of a city ordinance requiring second and third trimester abortions to be performed in hospitals and requiring minors to obtain parental or judicial consent before obtaining an abortion. And so what my dad was doing is he had submitted an amicus curiae brief, also known as a friend of the court brief, on behalf of the Ronald Reagan administration to the Supreme Court, just basically saying, look, we think there are some important issues here. We think the court should take into account the sovereign status of a state when deciding under Roe versus Wade and its framework whether or not this particular law presents an unconstitutional burden on access to an abortion. So it was that brief saying maybe you ought to give some deference to a state and its political subdivisions, including a city, before striking down a state law or a city ordinance like this. Now, this is hardly a remarkable proposition. This is hardly a ridiculous kind of assertion to make. In fact, I would say it's right at the core of what our constitutional system establishes, which is a federal system in which states, for the most part, are allowed to legislate in areas within their domain, and in which the federal sovereign acts over areas within the federal domain. It certainly isn't unreasonable. It certainly isn't worthy of scorn for that presidential administration to take the position in front of the highest court of the land that says there ought to be some deference paid to a state law or a city ordinance in this area. Nonetheless, they chose to travel at great distance on a Greyhound bus in order to protest in front of my parents' home in Northern Virginia. It scared me to death right at first because I didn't know what they were there to do. Once they had been there for a while, I realized, she's probably telling the truth. They're probably not here to hurt me. Although I have to confess something. At the time, I was really, really tempted to break out my stash of illegal fireworks that we had purchased from my cousins in Arizona, which they had purchased from the Indian reservation in Arizona earlier that year. I was really tempted to break out the firecrackers. I was really tempted to break out the garden hose or turn on the sprinklers. The movie Home Alone hadn't come out yet, but when I later saw the movie Home Alone, like 10 years later, I thought, I know exactly how that boy Kevin feels. When I was home alone, or just me and my sister, I felt the need to defend the turf that I was occupying. And I really, really wanted to turn the sprinklers on them and light my fireworks. But, I thought about it for a minute. And I thought, if I do that, the news cameras are going to show up. And that's not going to make my dad happy. That'll end up causing problems for my dad, be embarrassing to him, so I better not do it. So cooler heads prevailed that day. I decided not to do it. A little while later, a neighbor approached me and asked, are you okay? Are you scared? The truth is, I was kind of having the time of my life. I found it fascinating that this was going on. Here's the interesting thing. I mentioned that my parents were gone running errands. I think my brother was at a basketball game. Several of my sisters had gone with my parents. My oldest sister was away at college. Only my older sister Wendy and I were home. Wendy was asleep most of the time. But here's the funny thing. By the time my parents returned, the protesters had already left. And in fact, my parents returned right after these protesters left. I mean, right after. When my parents came back in the driveway, this was, of course, long before the days of cell phones, so I had no ability to contact them while they were out and say, hey, we're protesters in front of our house. But I was just waiting out there for when they arrived. I was standing in front of the basketball standard in our driveway, just, really anxious to tell them what had happened. And as soon as my parents drove up the driveway, I ran right up to the car and I said, Dad, you're never going to believe what's happened. Just then he said, as we were pulling out of the neighborhood, I saw a large Greyhound bus leaving the neighborhood. What do you suppose that was doing here? And I said, Dad, I've got a story to tell you. So I told him the whole story. He found it quite amusing that they had come all the way down from New York and New Jersey to protest in front of his home, had done so for several hours, gotten frustrated when he wasn't there, and finally left, quite interestingly, just seconds before he arrived at home. I later asked him, Dad, what would you have done had you been home, or had you come home while he was there? And he said, well, I would have gone out and talked to him. And I'm sure he would have. He was that kind of guy. He was a nice guy. He was willing to talk to people. To this day, though, I'm struck by a couple of things. Number one, I do have to admire their passion. Now, they were wrong. I believe they were wrong as a matter of federal constitutional law. And I also believe that they were wrong in the sense that it was wildly inappropriate to take a Greyhound bus into a residential neighborhood to protest in front of the home of a public servant where he raises his children. Can you imagine how wildly inappropriate that is? I just, to this day, I can't conceive of why somebody would think that was a good idea. By the way, they had children with them, apparently oblivious to the irony and to the inappropriateness of this. They brought children to a pro-abortion rights rally. I don't understand it. But it's also affected me in a different sense. I've thought many times, I at least admire their commitment to the Constitution. Now, they were wrong in what they were saying, I believe. They were wrong in how they did it. But I at least admired their conviction. The fact that they had feelings about the Constitution that they were willing to express. And while I wouldn't advise anyone ever to go and protest in front of someone's private residence, I do think that we as conservatives ought to be talking more about the Constitution. And I don't think protesting is necessarily what needs to happen so much as just discussing it with our friends and our neighbors, our family members, our co-workers, talking about what we think is the proper form of government. Too often we're afraid. Maybe some of us are ashamed. Maybe some of us just don't have the tools necessary to do it, or we're not sufficiently confident in our position to be able to know exactly how to use it in a general conversational tone or in the context of a political conversation. That's really the object of this book. That's why I wrote this book. I want this book to be a resource to people who want to be able to take the Constitution, understand the stories behind it, understand how it is we got to where we are, how the Constitution was drafted, where its various protections came from, in what ways they've been weakened, and in what ways we can strengthen them. And in what ways we can strengthen them by raising them in a political context and in a general conversational context. This book, I hope, I think, I intend that this book will provide readers with the tools to do that. There's a common misconception out there that the Constitution is something for lawyers or for courts, for judges and justices to worry about. It's not true. I mean, sure, lawyers, judges, justices, it's important for them to understand the Constitution. It is no less important for every one of us to understand it, lawyer or not, government official or not, politician or civilian, citizen. Any citizen of the United States can, and I believe should, learn every bit as much about the Constitution as any lawyer or judge or justice knows. In fact, it's not all that difficult to learn about it. Believe me, as a lawyer and as one who has devoted his entire career to learning how to practice law, to reading and studying the Constitution, I can tell you there is no reason why lawyers should have any better understanding than any other citizen when it comes to the Constitution. What's needed more than anything is for people to read the document itself. So even if you never read our lost Constitution, just read the actual Constitution. By the way, that reminds me of a story. Shortly after I published our lost Constitution, a good friend of mine, Senator Amy Klobuchar, she's a Democratic senator from the state of Minnesota, good friend of mine. We disagree on a lot of issues, but agree on some. She called me out of the blue the day after my book was published, and she said, I found it. I said, well, you found what? She said, I know where it is. It's in the archives. She's referring to the Constitution, making a joke on the title of my book. But the point is this. Every single one of us, just by reading the text of the Constitution, can learn more about it than any of us know now. Any of us tend to realize that we can learn. Just by reading the text itself, you can learn more about it than most Americans know. So if you do nothing else, just sit down and read the Constitution tonight. If you'd like to learn, and that's free of charge, you can find that anywhere. If you can't find a copy, you can stop by my office. I'll give you a free copy, or you can go online. You can download a free app with it in there. If you'd like to learn more about the Constitution, if you'd like to learn some of the stories behind it, track down a copy of my book, Our Lost Constitution. You can check it out at a library. You can borrow it from a friend, or if worse comes to worse, you can even buy it. They sell it on Amazon electronically in paperback or hardcover form. So anyway, please check it out, but most importantly, check out the Constitution. Read it. Care about it. Learn about why it's there. Learn about why it is that we need a Constitution. Its whole point is to limit government, and specifically to protect us against the dangers of too much power being concentrated in the hands of the few or in the hands of one person within the federal government. That's why it's there. That's why we need it. We've drifted from it. We've drifted from that understanding. We've lost it. We've come to think of rights as something very different than they are. Rights consist of that which the government may not do to you. And the Constitution outlines that. And the Constitution restricts and restrains the way government can operate. And the reason that's so important is because when we restrict government power through the Constitution, we unlock unlimited human potential. We make it possible for you to do what you do best, which is to work hard, provide for your family, live a good life, and do so without government coercion or interference by anyone. So anyway, look, together we can restore our Constitution, but it's going to take a sustained effort. It's going to require a lot of us to learn a lot more about it than we know now. So please help spread the word. And if you like what you're hearing tonight, please share this with your Facebook friends, and please like the Facebook page that I've set up here. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.